Dirty games. That is the story to start off our Monday. I told you at the beginning of this whole election campaign that obviously the ramifications of this election are really important and crazy for our country and how things are going to operate moving forward, depending on who we choose to lead the country. And I told you, because the ramifications are so high, the consequences are so high, the stakes are just insurmountable compared to previous elections, you knew things were going to get crazy and they were going to get greasy and it was going to get dirty. And that's exactly what we witnessed as CBC, surprise, CBC, a broken clock is right twice a day, broke a story of what the liberal war room, not just some random liberal voter, someone who's just trying to screw people. No, it was the people who are in the room with Mark Carney, Gerald Butts, Katie Telford, the who's who of the Liberal Party. The people who are in that room throughout this campaign were found planting divisive paraphernalia in a conservative convention to drum up drama, to drum up conflict, and to drum up confusion and be able to point the finger saying, see, that all they are these extremist right wingers. It was a fascinating story, and we have that, along with weird things happening in the prison system, and that could also affect our election. And last but not least, a MP or a conservative candidate out of Cape Breton laid the smack down in a debate last night, making it very clear to those who are older to remember who they are screwing over, depending on who they vote for. It was interesting. It was a fantastic day. But before we get into it, please take the time to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us get the channel out there. It amplifies the voice in such a critical point in our country's history, a critical point in our election cycle, and it does help us so much at this point in time. So if you could do that, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get into the story, shall we? As I was saying, liberals doing what they do best. That's what they're doing. They are lie, cheat, steal, kill, weak, meek. Everybody doing it. That is what we just witnessed as this story broke. CBC broke it, and listen to this. It is absolutely bonkers, y'all. Holy jumping.
Liberal operatives reportedly planted buttons with divisive messages at a conservative conference in Ottawa last week. But the campaign trick seems to have backfired. CBC's Kate McKenna broke the story and has more.
So last week I covered this conference, the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference, and it's an annual event where conservatives from across the country come and meet and talk about issues. And while I was there, I noticed a couple of buttons that I thought were strange. One said, "Stop the Steal," which is an apparent reference to the 2020 movement to overturn the U.S. election results. And the other had the name Jenny Byrne crossed out and replaced with Corey Teneycke. Byrne is the Conservative campaign manager, and Teneycke is a longtime Conservative strategist who has been critical of the ongoing election campaign. So it's conceivable that people at this conference made these pins, and in fact, I spent time last week trying to prove that, but recently I learned it was an operation undertaken by the Liberal War Room itself. Two operatives went to the conference and planted these buttons, and in an attempt to tie Conservative supporters to the politically toxic Donald Trump. I was having dinner with friends, and I saw some people who I recognized to be Liberal staffers. I overheard the person next to me, a man who had already identified himself as someone who was working in the Liberal War Room, and he's talking about how he was at the conference and planted these buttons in a Liberal campaign-sanctioned false flag operation. So I confronted him. He knew I was a journalist. I said, if you did that, then that's a story and I'll report it. At first, he conceded that he had said that, but once I said it was going to be a story, he denied having said anything at all. So I left shortly after, and then at a separate bar, a Conservative source told me another Liberal campaign staffer was also talking about it. So the next day, I put in a request for comment with the Liberal Party, and they didn't deny it. It's not unusual for political parties to play tricks like this during a campaign, but it is unusual to hear about it from them.
What a statement. It's not unusual for things like this to happen, but it is unusual to hear it directly from them. Admit it, we were there. And exactly, that's how this works. That's how things like this happen. I've seen actually police officers do this in the past when they're trying to track down a suspect, trying to track down who committed a crime. And often what they'll do is, if it's a smaller community, they'll go to the bar of the community. And typically, if someone's committed a crime, they usually they get a little braggadocious. And they always have to tell somebody. And so when that conversation happens, someone else overhears it and people talk. And that's exactly what the Liberal Party did here. The Liberal War Room, no less. People, as I said, are working with Mark Carney, working with Gerald Butts, working with Katie Telford on a regular basis, saying, yeah, we planted this divisive messaging to make the Conservatives look bad at the CSFN. And we want to make sure that there are social media photos of it, make sure they're spread around to show how awful this Conservative Party is and how divisive they are to this country. That just happened in our country last week and reported yesterday. My friends, as I said, this is a very, very dirty, sleazy campaign and one I've never seen in my life. It's getting very ugly. And this is a terrible and gross thing to do, quite frankly. As I talked about in yesterday's episode, people are questioning if you believe the polls. And the Liberals are coming out, oh, you can't do that. That's you're starting the beginnings of toxic messaging. Oh, that they're going to deny the election. You can't be doing that. You can't be doing that. And we were just simply asking, do you believe the polls? It's a genuine question. And then I will flip this back on the Liberal Party and Liberal supporters. Do you believe the polls? Because what I'm gathering is you don't. What I'm gathering is this is behavior of a desperate party. And if this is coming directly from their war room, they have the intel on their end, knowing that this isn't good. And people do stuff like this when they know they are losing. If they are winning, they wouldn't bother. Like, yeah, we don't need to take the risk. We don't need to do it. But because they know it's tight and they are losing, no matter what the polls say, they know that they need to do something to get people riled up and mad at the Conservative Party, mad at Donald Trump, tie them to Donald Trump as much as possible. And for them to go to a local bar and be bragging about it amongst themselves and then be overheard by a reporter, these people are absolute fools. They're sloppy. And what can I say? It sums up the Liberal Party as a whole, doesn't it? They've never really done things well. Can't run a government and can't even run their campaign properly. Yikes. And so the question then began, if found guilty, is this breaking rules? Is this breaking the law of Elections Canada? And well, that's the conversation people are having. And we did some follow-up, and David Jacobs talks about this. He says, this keeps getting worse. These are violations of sections 92, 320, and 482 of the Canada Elections Act, carrying penalties of up to $5,000 and 5 years in prison. Whoever ordered this and everyone involved is in serious trouble. They should seek independent legal counsel immediately. Here are the violations. Section 92, it is illegal to falsely claim to be a candidate, a representative of a candidate, or a member of a political party with the intent to mislead voters. Section 320, all election advertising, including signs and digital content, must include an authorization tagline identifying who paid for it and authorized it. Failing to include this or misrepresenting the source is an offense. Section 482B is an offense to induce a person to vote or refrain from voting for a particular candidate through intimidation or fraudulent means, which could encompass false representations designed to manipulate voter behavior. Penalties include up to $2,000 in fines or 1 year in prison on summary conviction or up to $5,000 and 5 years on indictment. These aren't wrong. These are proper citations of Elections Canada. But the problem is the Liberals have already been doing it. They've been caught doing it. We've seen how connected they are to China and the CCP. They are going around intimidating voters. We literally saw Paul Chang do it, saying, hey, go get that Conservative member and take him down to the Chinese consulate and you can collect a bounty on him. That actively goes against our laws in this country, and he hasn't been fined. He's not going to prison. Nothing's happening. And I only am citing these things because it shows you the seriousness of what they did and committed to. But is anything going to happen to them? No. Will a process maybe thrown at them? Yeah. But it won't be until after the election, and it won't matter at that point. The problem is they know this. They have authorities in their pocket. They have the media in their pocket. And I'm quite frankly surprised CBC turned on them like this. And Kate McKinnon reported it. Fair play. Good for her. As a reporter, you did your job. Congratulations. Thank you for doing it. But they know they've rigged the game, and they're really hard to be caught. And at the end of the day, sure, you're going to have a couple people who can speak against them, but is there going to be enough to find them guilty of it? Who knows? It quite frankly doesn't really matter at this point. What matters is the story. The punishment needs to be the story, the public exposure to the story, and showing what the Liberals are all about and what they've been trying to do. And if this gets out, and if this story continues to push on, it'll show, okay, if the Liberals have been trying to do something like this, what else are they lying about? However, for some of these people, it doesn't really matter. Even Rachel Gilmore, of all people, reported on this story. And honestly, kudos to her. Fair play. She says, wow, this is a super gross move. And when they talked about it with an earshot of a press gallery journalist, this is dumb. But I'm glad they were so sloppy because now we know about this scummy ploy. You're so far ahead. Why go so low? It's just icky. Well, Rachel, it's because they're not really ahead and they know it. But the problem is not really her tweet. It's more so the responses in the comments. It's people saying this is why nobody really takes her seriously because journalists aren't supposed to judge. They're supposed to report. Can we first find out exactly who the people were that did this? Top level liberals or no accounts up to mischief with no input into much of anything regarding the party? It does make a difference. Shannon says, is there any proof that this is real or is this just empty accusations? Keep in mind the conservatives have been lying boldly and repeatedly, so not much value is in their word alone. It's called hearsay, Rachel. And a responsible ethical journalist would have attempted to identify the speaker and verify the info before reporting it as fact. Again, this is how this all works. Some of these liberal supporters are so caught up in their own ideology and their own thinking that no matter what this party does, they won't believe it. And if it comes out as true, they'll be like, oh, no, they were right in doing that. We got to make sure these evil conservatives never get into power. So whatever it takes, I'm okay to do that. This is how broken our political dialogue is in our country at this point. It's just the reality and it stinks. I hate it, but here we are. This is what you're up against, folks. Rupa made the comment that I think all of us were thinking when we saw this break. She says, remember the swastika and Confederate flags of the Freedom Convoy? The ones nobody on the ground actually saw, but somehow we kept seeing the same few stock photos recycled over and over to paint the protesters as racists? That is a question we've all been wondering. Remember when that happened and it was clear we didn't have evidence of it, but it was weird that this Nazi flag just randomly showed up out of nowhere. This Confederate flag showed up out of nowhere with a guy in a mask that no one could identify. But at the very time that he showed up at the convoy, Trudeau's photographer was there to make sure he got the perfect photo of it to then spread around as propaganda. Weird timing, weird situation. No one was able to identify the man, and the man was then chased off from the convoy. Anyone who can put two and two together can say that looked like a false flag event. It looked like they were trying to discredit the convoy and try to spread it in the media, which they did so successfully, and they made sure to run with it in the House of Commons. This is what we're currently witnessing. If they were caught doing this with the buttons, you know they've likely done this with other things that felt weird and didn't pass the sniff test. We don't have proof, but these are things to kind of keep in mind. And speaking on the idea of weird things happening, Conservative candidate Ron Chinzer talked about this document being found behind prison bars of a prison here in this country. He says this document was found behind bars and handed over by a prison guard. Are the liberals seriously trying to win over convicted criminals by targeting conservative crime policies? When you wonder why crime is on the rise, just remember that the Liberal Party is yet again putting violent criminals, even those behind bars, before the safety of innocent Canadians. That's low even for them. After a decade of rising crime and chaos, this is the last thing we need. And this is allegedly a government document printed with Government of Canada letterhead showing what the Conservative Pierre Poilievre policies are on his stance on crime. And obviously he has a pretty strong stance on crime. And this was allegedly passed to inmates, meaning they are likely trying to win over the vote of inmates. The thing is, I'm not really trying to jump on the story too much because we need to verify some details first before we can actually run with it. Yes, it's a good start that a conservative candidate was bringing it up, but just because a conservative candidate posted about it doesn't mean it is necessarily true. We don't know what the details of the story are, and we want to make sure we take our time with it. However, if it is true, well, it's pretty telling. And I know a lot of the questions you're asking is this legal? Can convicts actually vote in Canada? And I will say yes. They've been able to vote since 2002. They are legally allowed to vote in Canadian elections. You can disagree with it, but it's the reality. But again, it goes back to the point. If the story is true, we still got to verify some things because there's some things about it that are just kind of weird. First off, crime reform proposal. They're not spelling proposal correctly. And then even just the way they've kind of named the file down here just seems weird. There's some things about this particular document that doesn't necessarily pass the sniff test for me yet. So before we jump on it, I want to verify some details about it. But if this is true, well, again, it goes back to the point I made. If they are winning, why are they doing weird stuff like this? You know what I'm saying? Too big to rig, right? Too big to rig. And when we talk about too big to rig, there's people who legitimately think, oh man, the votes are going to be fraudulent. There's going to be weird vote counting on the night of the election, yada, yada, yada. Yep, we have to keep an eye out for that stuff, but I'm not actually too worried about that. I'm more so worried about everything leading up to the election. I'm worried about these polls that are swaying public opinion. I'm worried about the media biased coverage of candidates swaying public opinion. I'm worried about placing fake memorabilia at a conservative conference to drum up fear on social media. These are the things I'm worried about in terms of making it too big to rig. We are up against $1 billion machine in this election. And all you can do is get out to vote. Voting is already now open. get out, cast your ballot, and do so early. And then I want to take us one last story to finish us up here. I want to talk about Alec McMaster. He is a Conservative candidate running for Cape Breton-Canso. And he recently did a debate sponsored by the CBC up in Cape Breton. And this was his last statement to the voters in his riding, calling for them to vote for him. And quite frankly, I really appreciated the argument he made here.
For all the seniors who live in Cape Breton-Canso, Antigonish, turn off the television. Pick up the phone, call a young person, maybe your son, your daughter, your grandchild. Ask them what they think. They are our future. They have a vision. They want something different than the government they've had. They want real change, and I can bet you most of them are voting Conservative this time.
Too big to rig. This election is going to come down to a generational divide. The liberal boomers versus the younger generation. And in some cases, just based on even the demographics of this show, I know that I don't even think all the boomers are voting liberal. I think there is a swath and a good chunk of boomers who are like, I'm done with this BS myself and I'm voting Conservative based on what I see the demographics of our show. And to that, kudos to you. But in general, this is the plea, is to those liberal-minded boomers who all of a sudden Mark Carney shows up and they're just like, oh, I'm going to vote liberal now because I'm scared of Donald Trump. When that's honestly a pretty fake threat, if I'm being quite frank with you. But yet all the young people who have their future in front of them, who can't see themselves buying a home, who can't see themselves getting ahead, who can't see themselves affording their groceries, who can't see themselves paying for their power bills. Those are the ones who are voting Conservative in this election because they're the only party who are actually offering real change with real policies that aren't going to keep us under the boot of the government. It is going to be a fascinating one to watch. But anyways, enjoy your Monday. Have yourselves a good one. I'm out.